הנה מה טוב ומנעים שבשחים גם יוחד הנה מה טוב ומנעים שבשחים גם יוחד.
Shalom and welcome to Jewish Insights. As we think about the holiday of Shavuot, one of the customs of Shavuot is what's called Tikkun Leil Shavuot, the idea that people stay up the entire night learning Torah in preparation for receiving the Torah the next morning. I have memories of staying up all night to learn Torah in Livingston, New Jersey, where I grew up, in Long Island, going to a place called Shar Yashu for their Tikkun Leil Shavuot, my year in Jerusalem, running all over town from place to place to hear different people speak. One year I spent it in Renana with family there, and of course these days I'm usually in Englewood, New Jersey. Another feature of Shavuot is reading Megillat Ruth, the story of Ruth. Today I want us to focus on and learn a little bit more of that story of Ruth, and to do that I'm excited to introduce my guest today, Dr. Yael Ziegler. So I first met Dr. Yael Ziegler when I was a student at Yeshivat Har Etzion, known to many as the Gush, a yeshiva in Israel, where I had the amazing zchut to come into her class there in Herzog College on the book of Joshua, and I remember her distinctly comparing the book of Joshua to the book of Numbers and seeing how they're in conversation with each other. And I had never been in a Torah class before where a teacher was kind of using that type of literary analysis that I might see in a comparative literature class I had in college, using that to unfold the ideas behind Devarim, Numbers, and Joshua. And then I think a year or two after that, she came out with this amazing book on Ruth, or Ruth in English, I should say. The subtitle is From Alienation to Monarchy. And I picked up that book, and I honestly, I think every year when I'm asked to teach for Shavuot, I pick a different chapter in this book to teach from. It's an amazing overview. There's so much depth, and literally each chapter could be its own class en route. And so I'm thrilled today, when I wanted to think of someone to talk to about this book, to invite Dr. Ziegler on, and she graciously agreed.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. And I'll say a little bit more with your permission. Dr. Yael Ziegler is an assistant professor in Bible at Herzog College. That's where I learned with her. And she's the director of the Kitvuni Writing Fellowship at Matan. She received her PhD in Bible at Bar Ilan University and is also a graduate of Stern Yeshiva. Dr. Ziegler has lectured widely on various Bible topics all over the world. And she is the author of several books, including Promises to Keep, The Oath in Biblical Narrative, Ruth from Alienation to Monarchy, which we'll be discussing today, and Lamentations, that's Echa in Hebrew, Faith in a Turbulent World. She is currently working on a book on the first 15 chapters of Exodus on Shemot. Dr. Ziegler, welcome so much. I'm so excited to see you.
Thank you.
So first of all, thank you for zooming in here. I know that you're usually in Alon Shavuot. You're in Yerushalayim right now. Let's just start, for those of our audience members who don't know who you are you? Introduce yourself for us, please.
Okay, so I'm Yael Ziegler. My great passion is teaching Bible. So I've been teaching Bible for over 30 years, mostly in the Jerusalem area, but also in different places around the world where sometimes I'm invited to teach. And it's a great privilege. It's also, there's a lot of excitement in teaching the Bible today because so much of what is happening in the Bible is being revived today in Israel. For the first time in 2,000 years, we have the Jewish people have a state, we have autonomy in Israel, and all sorts of questions and topics that come up in the Bible come up again today. And so I think that that's made teaching Bible today a little different, a little more exciting, a lot more relevant, many of the topics.
Beautiful. And I know, I noticed you dedicate the book to your parents, this one at least, Ruth, saying a little bit about how they inspired that love of Bible in you. Just say a couple sentences about how did you become interested in learning more about Bible that led you to where you are today.
Well, yes, my parents are definitely an influence. I grew up in Philadelphia. Neither of my parents are from Philadelphia. Neither of my parents grew up in Orthodox homes. And both of them came to Orthodoxy with a great desire to learn about it. And so our house was a house of learning. My father actually is a scientist. And my mother, who unfortunately passed away, and I dedicated the book to her, her name was actually Naomi Ruth. So it was an appropriate book to work on, given that two of the main characters in the book are Naomi and Ruth. But my mother was actually a piano teacher, And she also taught Hebrew for many years of her life. She loved language. She loved music. Those two go together. But she was also a person, I think, of great kindness, of great generosity. She spent a lot of her life hosting and trying to be compassionate to others. And everyone loved her, and she was very friendly and kind. And so part of that, I think, part of her inspiration really gave me a great love for the characters in the book of Ruth, and particularly Ruth herself, who is the eponymous heroine of the book, and the book is named after her. But in many ways, she reminded me of my mother.
Beautiful. I hope our few minutes together today maybe can lift her neshama up even more, and spread her name, and also spread the Torah learning in her memory. So may her neshama have an aliyah. So before we get into Ruth itself, I mentioned this in my introduction, kind of coming into your classroom and noticing something a little bit different than what I was used to when it comes to learning Torah. Say a little bit around, what is your methodology? Where does it come from? Just share a little bit of that. And, of course, maybe this is obvious, maybe it's not, but there's many different ways to approach thinking about sitting down with the text of Torah and understanding it. So, take us through your version.
Yeah, well, I mean, I in the first chapter of my book, I really do talk about my methodology, because I think that there is something about the way that I'm teaching which needed spelling out, and the way that I'm writing as well. I'm very much a product of what has often been considered two very different worlds in terms of studying the Bible. On the one hand, I was raised in traditional learning. I went to an Orthodox day school. I went to an Orthodox high school. And even for my first degree, I went to Yeshiva University, which is an Orthodox college. And I studied text using traditional methods. I used rabbinic interpretation, midrash, medieval rabbinic interpretation. And then I was also, for my MA and my PhD, I went to Bar-Ilan University, where I was really introduced to more academic approaches to Bible study. And there I specialized in Bible. When I was at Yeshiva University, I wasn't particularly specializing in Bible. I was actually at the time thinking of being a lawyer, and I was studying political science more. So, things took a turn. But when I did get to Bar-Ilan University, and I was really focused on Bible, so I was spending a lot of time reading academic approaches to Bible. And at some point, what I understood is that I really wanted to fuse these two worlds of learning. I wanted to take the rigor and the systematic analysis and some of the methodology that I had encountered in academia, and to fuse it with some of the traditional methods, and particularly the goal of the traditional method, which is really to search for meaning and religious insights in the text. So, to sort of be a little reductive about it, if in the traditional in the academia, in academic learning, it was sort of aimed at the head, right? And in more traditional learning, it was more aimed at the heart. Well, I thought really these two should be fused together, and to see whether or not we can use some of the rigor and methodology in order to try to draw out some of the deeper meanings and the more inspirational, let's say, meanings of the story, and how they can affect us, not just in terms of knowledge, but also in terms of the way in which we live our lives.
Wow, beautiful. So this strikes me as like I'm jumping into another field for a moment, but the way one might think about science, for example, right? So you could have a version of this where you look to Torah for the myth story of creation, and then there's this science thing over there, which is scientific and in the brain, and then a fusion of that would be, well, how can I take the values in the Torah and also learn from what the science world is putting out and help that infuse more meaning into it, how I understand God or how I understand the Creator, something along those lines. And you're saying you're doing something here as well, which is, if I could go back to high school when I was, had my, Shakespeare class at 1 hour and then my, my Tanakh class at the other, can I use the skill set that I'm using in my Shakespeare class, comparing characters, looking at words that repeat themselves, those kinds of things, can I use that and recognize that there's a message there that's not only a literary analysis, but that helps me connect with the Torah, the message, God, whatever we're gleaning from Torah study. Beautiful. Okay, great. So let's bring that into the book we're talking about today, which is the book of Ruth or Rus, depends who you ask, in different communities. Tell us just a little bit, for those who have not reviewed the book of Ruth since last year or ever, just what are the main plot points? What, mention Ruth and Naomi, kind of what goes on in this book?
Okay, well, actually, I mean, I think one of the first questions that we would ask about the book is that it really seems to be a pretty mundane book, right? It doesn't have the drama of the book of Esther, where the fate of the Jewish people hangs in the balance, right? It's really a pretty mundane book that focuses on one family in one little town in Israel. And this family lives in Beit Lechem, which is south of Jerusalem. And there's a famine in the land, and the family leaves the land and goes to Moab, right, which is in the area of Jordan today, right? And when they're in Moab, this is all the backdrop of the story. The father of the family dies, and the two sons die, leaving only Naomi, who's the mother, and the wives of these sons, the two daughters-in-law. And Naomi decides to go back to Beit Lechem.
And just pause 1 second. And so these two daughter-in-laws, they marry in Moab, right? They're two Moabite women, right? Ruth and Orpah. Okay, great. Keep going.
Two Moabite daughters-in-law, and they accompany Naomi, and Naomi tries to dissuade them from coming, especially because it seems as though she assumes that they're coming only for the purposes of finding another husband, and she dissuades them. She doesn't think that will be possible. So Orpah goes back to Moab, and Ruth takes this wonderful oath of loyalty that shows her devotion to Naomi. And it's, such a wonderful proclamation that even people who don't know the book of Ruth, oftentimes they do know this speech, because it comes up in all sorts of, movies and TV shows. Whither thou goest, I will go. Whither thou liest, I will lie, right? Your people are my people. Your God is my God. So there's this wonderful speech that Ruth makes to Naomi, telling her that she's going to stay with her. When they get back to Beit Lechem, however, they are confronted with two very serious problems. One is survival in the short term, namely obtaining food, and the other is survival in the long term, namely obtaining children. Right, and these two problems become sort of the goal of the book. In chapter 2, we have Boaz, who is one of the great heroes of the story, perhaps the only really great hero that we find when we get back to Beit Lechem. He provides food for Ruth, who then gives the food over to Naomi. And in chapter 3, Boaz provides a promise of marriage to Ruth, who then gives that over to Naomi. And the story ends with, all these loose ends being tied up. It's sort of this, and they lived happily ever after ending, right? A child is born, Ruth is married, this child is born, and we have kind of the revival of the family of Naomi that was threatened with extinction. In many ways, this is, I sort of called it an undramatic story, but on the flip side of it, it's really a masterful short story. Everything that was problematic at the beginning of the story is resolved by the end of the story, and linguistically, that point is made, really over and over in the book, so that every word that appears to describe their problems at the beginning of the story and the potential collapse of the family then reappears at the end of the book to show the opposite. And from what I understand, this book is taught in literature departments also to show an example of a really perfect short story.
Wow. And just a side note for our viewers, a fun fact. So we mentioned Ruth and Orpah. Orpah does not follow, and Orpah is also the source of the name for famous host and personality Oprah Winfrey, of course. So people love that name. So stick with that for 1 second. So first, I want to commend you because as I hear this interview, you grew up in Philadelphia, I assume English-speaking home, correct? And now you are, a leading scholar in analyzing a text in Hebrew. I remember actually your class was accessible for me because your Hebrew was accessible, so I was able to sit in a Hebrew class. But you're someone who, inspiration for our viewers to pick up Hebrew, learn Hebrew, be able to read text in Hebrew, and then teach in it. Because I think to be able to point out the linguistic comparisons obviously is a whole new level, and you're doing it in the language that's not your original language. So tell us a little bit. So I hear what you're saying around this kind of small, mundane story about just one family, which seems actually in some ways ironic given that it's the weekend of Shavuot where we're celebrating this massive moment of all of the Jewish people at Mount Sinai with God, right? And you compare it to Megillat Esther, the story of Esther, which is, life is in the balance for the Jewish people. Why? Why is it written in the first place? And why is it significant? Why are we reading it? Why?
Well, first of all, that's an excellent question, and it's perhaps the most important question. It's also the question that rabbinic interpreters ask. They really are very blunt about this. Why was this book written? And they offer several different answers. One, I think, is an answer that is very commonly cited, but it requires further explanation, and that is the answer that it is written in order to teach us the great reward for people who do kindness and good deeds, what we call chesed, right? Now, the reason that I think that answer requires a little bit of elaboration is because a whole book just to teach us about kindness, and there's so many people in the Bible who do acts of chesed, acts of compassion and generosity. Starting with Abraham and God himself, right? There's so many role models for kindness. One wonders what Ruth has to add to the story. And the second reason that I think that this is an answer that requires elaboration is because there's actually a very peculiar element to the kindness and the chesed that Ruth does in the book. And that is that it's very, very altruistic, the type of chesed that she does, the type of kindness that she does, almost to the point of self-abnegation, right? It really seems to be the kind of kindness that I don't know if I could sell it, right? It is, if you think about it, when she comes back with Naomi, after Naomi tells her, "You have no future with me. I have, no possibility of finding you a husband in Beit Lechem." And I think Naomi says that quite sincerely, given the fact that Naomi and her family left the people during a time of famine, and the people feel quite incensed with Naomi, and they do not actually treat her very kindly when she comes back. And yet Ruth decides to stay with Naomi. She then offers to go down to the field and pick like a pauper. It must be, it's not a very nice situation for Ruth to be in. She has to a little bit relinquish her dignity. Later on in the story, when Ruth does eventually have a child, she's going to kind of relinquish that child to Naomi. Now, on the one hand, that's the point of the story. The point of the story is that we're rebuilding the family of Naomi. But after Ruth has this child, it's almost as though she is erased from the story. She hands the child on to Naomi, and it feels as though this sort of kindness is very self-nullifying. So it's an odd sort of kindness, and it's also something which doesn't seem to be an adequate reason for the book. And so I'll just mention that there is another reason. Yeah.
Before you get to that, a couple clarifying questions. One, why is everyone incensed at Naomi? It sounds like she's a sad case. She lost her husband and 2 sons and returns back to Israel. Why is everyone mad at her?
Yeah, so that is an important question, because it's not just that people are mad at her; it's that they completely ignore her. Right? Nobody brings her food. She gets back to Beit Lechem, and everyone just sort of turns and says, "Oh, is that Naomi?" And then leave her to starve. So I'm sort of assuming that they're angry at her, and the reason is because it seems as though not only did Naomi and her family leave during a time of famine, but it seems that they left with plentiful food that could have been used to help others. That assumption is made by rabbinic interpreters in the Midrash, and oftentimes I think those midrashim seem to be not based in the simple meaning of the story itself. But in this particular case, I think that rabbinic interpreters say this because of where they go, where the family goes during the famine. They go to Moab, right, which is a place which is cited in the Bible as a place where people are not generous with giving food. In fact, in Deuteronomy, in chapter 23, the verses tell us that we cannot marry into the Moabite nation because they are known to be people who do not share their food with others. making them the opposite of the Abraham-like nation. So the assumption, I think, of rabbinic interpreters is that if the family of Naomi goes to Moab during the famine, it means that they have plentiful food, and that's why that's an explanation for why nobody is kind to Naomi when she comes back, right? And they leave her pretty much to starve.
So they do an act of the opposite of chesed. They say, let's take our food and run. Let's go to a place where you don't have to share your food because we have enough. And then they come back with no husband, no sons, and no food, and they're met with not a lot of help except for Boaz, who you mentioned. Okay, great. And then you just finished pointing out that Ruth not only epitomizes chesed, and why would there be a book just about chesed? Although I'm a Musar person, so for me, we need more books about chesed, let's say, but Jewish character development when I say Musar. But that it's not only chesed, that it's something more than that. You use the word altruism or self-abrogation, this idea that she's, in some ways, it's like a weird thing to imagine. She has a baby and just hands it off to Naomi in the final scene as though like she did her part and disappears. So I guess you're raising a concern. One explanation is that it's about teaching chesed, but there's a problem with the chesed because you feel like maybe it's not a healthy sense of chesed to be so self-limiting in that way. Great. And then you were about to share, I think, a second reason.
Yeah, so the second reason I think actually is going to explain my problems with the first.
Okay.
The second reason, which rabbinic interpreters offer for the reason that Ruth is written, is to tell us the backdrop of the birth of David the king, but not just David the king, David who launches the legitimate dynasty of monarchy in Israel. And that answer, it's based on the fact that the final verse in the book of Ruth is the birth of David, and that the story of Ruth and Boaz and their marriage is the story of being the progenitors of David and of the Davidic dynasty. And so, what I will just sort of briefly conclude this long idea with is that I think that the type of chesed, the type of kindness that Ruth does, it's not really something which we are all expected to do. It's not being sold to, every person in Israel. And by the way, the best kind of kindness that you could do is that if you have a child, you should really give it to somebody else if they need it more than you, right? That seems to be a rather absurd kind of conclusion. But the type of kindness that Ruth does, it is absolutely necessary for the king, right? Mm-hmm. I think that if you combine these two answers, what you understand is that the book of Ruth is dealing with something much broader than this one family. It's dealing with the foundations of kingship. Kingship being perhaps the most effective type of leadership during biblical times, but one that, of course, as we know, can easily lead to tyranny, to debauchery, to all sorts of bad uses of power. Power corrupts, as we know, and kings are absolute. They have absolute power, and therefore the idea is that the king of Israel has to be someone who everything that comes into his hand, the power of the judiciary, the power of the treasury, the power of the military, is not something that he sees as being for himself, but rather he sees himself as a vehicle for giving to others. And that is exactly the kind of kindness that Ruth does. So I think that that's the real answer. The real answer, I think, is that the book of Ruth is the book that teaches us how to produce strong leadership that is also not corrupt leadership.
Wow, beautiful. Okay, great. A couple clarifying questions there. One is, I think that's the beautiful message, which is, everyone should aspire for chesed, but not go so far in chesed that it's unhealthy. Unless you're a king, then you should, be so empathetic and putting others before yourself because you're responsible, for the country, for the people, all those things. That explains why it was written, but why on Shavuot then? Why are we reading? Why do we care about David specifically on Shavuot?
Well, there are a lot of answers given to this question. It's not a question that it's not a Bible question, right? The book itself never says, read me on Shavuot, right? This is a much later tradition. And by the way, it's not a tradition that is in every community, right? In other words, here in Israel, I think we're much more intertwined, not just with our Ashkenazi, not just with the Jews of Western Europe, but there's a lot of different communities from North Africa and from Yemen. And I don't quite remember who does and who doesn't, but I've certainly taught the book and gotten quite a blank face when I said, but we read the book on Shavuot. And someone in my class said, no, we don't, right? So that's, the more inclusive way. So, it is a much later tradition. I'm not entirely sure exactly at what point it takes off. I'll give the classic answer, and then I'll give the answer that sits perhaps better with me. The classic answer is that Ruth is a wonderful example of an outsider who comes into Israel because she wants to embrace God, because she wants to embrace Naomi, the Jewish people, the way of life, the commandments, right? In fact, her speech of loyalty in rabbinic readings becomes the speech of loyalty that every convert to Judaism is meant to say, right? It's kind of parsed into all sorts of ways of trying to speak to a convert and to make sure that they have that same kind of loyalty and devotion. So, of course, on Shavuot, which is the holiday in which we receive the Torah and we accept upon ourselves the commandments, it's beautiful to read this story of this woman who voluntarily does so. So that's sort of I would say, the most traditional answer. I have a little bit of a broader conception. When I think of Shavuot, I think of it within the context of the three major holidays. We have Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And, I look at it as this sort of almost annual experience that is also an experience that mirrors the trajectory of the spiritual journey, right? So that Passover is the youth and the initial excitement, and we read the Song of Songs, which is a love story. It's the beginning of our journey as spiritual beings. And if you skip ahead to Sukkot, which is a holiday in which we are reaping, we're bringing in, we're enjoying the fruit of the harvest, it represents kind of the end of the spiritual journey. And on that day, we read the book of Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, which is this kind of almost philosophic treatise on the meaning of life, which seems to reflect some kind of, retrospective end of journey. And the middle point is Ruth. And I love that, because Ruth is about how we experience daily life as members of a community, who are serving God, not with this, kind of early love story or late stage retrospection, but really with just the experiences of interacting with daily life. So that's the way I look at it.
Beautiful. Okay. So, it connects into Shavuot and the Sinai moment, because Sinai is that moment of covenant and receiving Torah. And so someone who's going to join the Jewish people, let's say as a convert, this is like the story that tells that story. And maybe that awakens us to also being sensitive to people like that joining the Kehillah. Beautiful. And the second one is kind of this, it's the road between Passover and Sukkot. It's the road between, that first love and looking back on life. It's somewhere in the middle. This is kind of the journey that evolves beautifully. Say a little bit around the authorship of the book also. I'm just curious. I know there's always each book of the Bible has a story of who wrote it. What's the story here?
Okay, so it's one of the complex questions of the biblical books, because they don't come with a title page, right? We're so accustomed to the title page, what was the date of publishing and who is the author, and when was it written? These are things that are always going to be debated within our tradition. And our tradition with regard to the book of Ruth is that the person who wrote it is Samuel, which is really interesting for two reasons. The first reason is because Samuel was the prophet in the first book of Samuel who anointed two kings. The first king that he anointed is Saul, and the second king that he anointed was David. Now, when Samuel anoints Saul, he becomes his kind of mentor, and he develops this very strong relationship with Saul, and he really, accompanies him on this journey towards becoming a king. And at some point, of course, Saul sins and God rejects him from kingship. And at that point, God says to Samuel, I have rejected Saul. I want you to go and anoint David instead. And Samuel doesn't seem very enthusiastic about this, but he's an obedient prophet. And so he goes to David, and he goes to David's house, and he anoints David. And the anointing of David is completely different than the moment, the great joyous moment when he anointed Saul. When he anointed Saul, he pours the oil on his head, and he kisses him, and he makes this great proclamation, I have anointed you as king over Israel. And when he anoints David, he pours some oil on his head, turns around and leaves. Okay. No kiss, no great proclamation. And then actually within the story itself, David and Samuel actually never exchange words with each other. They meet again, but there's not a very well-developed relationship there. And it seems as though Samuel is doing his best to keep his distance, which I think is a very human portrayal of Samuel. The problem is, of course, that because God has rejected Saul and chosen David, there's this kind of civil war that unfolds, and it's a terrible section in the Bible. And Samuel never really gets up and announces to the community at large, by the way, God has chosen David as king. So one theory is that when Samuel writes the book of Ruth, he's putting in writing what he maybe couldn't really bring himself to say out loud, right? He's showing this is the backdrop of the king of King David. This is the backdrop of the legitimate king of the legitimate dynasty of monarchs.
Wow.
So that I think, that I think is one very strong point. So that the other point, which is a really, really important point in the book of Ruth, is that Samuel writes two other books according to our tradition. One is his own book, the book of Samuel, and the other is the book of Judges. Now, what's really interesting about this is that if Samuel wrote both the book of Judges and the book of Ruth, well, Ruth starts out with the words, and it was in the days of the judging of the judges. And so one wonders why he put these books in separate books, right? He basically writes two books about the same time period. And the question is why? And I think that leads us on a road to really understanding what the book of Ruth is about and why it's such an important book. Because the book of Judges is a book, it's a terrible book. It's really a terrible book. It's the book of the first period of settlement in the land of Israel, and it comes right after Joshua. Joshua is the story of the conquest of the land, and the book of Judges is the book of the first period of settlement. And it's a period in which the society of Israel unravels. It is just a complete disaster, right? And it unravels in many ways. It unravels religiously. The people start worshiping idols and they don't serve God properly. But even more significantly, I think for our purposes, it unravels socially. It becomes a social experiment gone wrong. I mean, it's an utter disaster. Just to give you a sense of what an utter disaster it is, it ends in civil war, right? It doesn't get worse than that. And so if the book of Judges is the book of how a society unravels, I think the book of Ruth is kept separate from the book of Judges by Samuel in order to show us, how do you put Humpty Dumpty back together again, right? How can you remake a society that seems to have really come crashing to a halt, which is a remarkable set of books, as I said, not just in order to understand what was happening in biblical times, but if I may be so bold as to say, maybe it can also help us with our experiment today, trying to rebuild a society in the land of Israel, and noting that there are some really very delicate problems that could lead to disaster, but that, perhaps we also can find in the book of Ruth the means for rebuilding and launching a new period.
Beautiful. Okay, so I want to follow all this. So what I'm tracking here is Samuel arrives after the book of Judges, right? We have Joshua is the story, Moses dies, Joshua brings the people into the land, that story of conquering and then settling the land, which is followed by the book of Judges, where we hear kind of these, I'll add individual stories about different kind of tribes within Israel. And then after that comes the book of Samuel. And in the book of Samuel, also written by Samuel, that's where we have the anointing of the first king, Saul, and then the anointing of the second king, David. And I heard you say that David, because Samuel is so emotionally invested in Saul, that giving up on that dynasty and everything he invested and then switching over to David is maybe a bit too emotional for him to almost lead properly. He doesn't get out in front of the people and say, this is what God's will is, let's move on, it's David. And so one motivation perhaps for him writing this book is as a, let's call it a tikkun, a healing, a way, later in life to write down this story that raises up the Davidic dynasty. And the second I hear you saying is also, I guess Samuel wrote about the history before Samuel. And the history before Samuel is all the different stories of the judges and the story of Ruth. But Ruth is not part of the story of Judges because the story of Judges is everything falling apart. And the story of Ruth is kind of starting with everything falling apart and making everything come together. And then your last point, which I want to hear a little bit more about, was, why this especially feels relevant today is what I heard you say. So I'm going to push, you spoke very metaphorically and in big terms, but say a little bit more, going from the text of the book to the world today. What do you see there as what are the messages that feel like they can help us, build society in a way that's constructive like Ruth?
Yeah, well, first of all, there's so much to say, but I'm going to focus on what I think is the most important. One thing that I think is clear is that Samuel is creating a dialogue between these two books, right? And the one thing that I think that really maybe it's the most important point also in the biblical books, but I think it might be the most important point today as well. And that is that as the book of Judges unravels and falls apart, we find ourselves in these final 5 chapters of the book where there's no leadership. Right? Leadership has really just been constantly kind of deteriorating and unraveling throughout the book. And at the end, there's no leadership. But not only is there no leadership, but in the final 5 chapters of the book, what you find is a tremendous amount of characters that don't have names. Right? They're just anonymous characters. So you have this man and his concubine, and you have the concubine's father, and you have the man's attendant, and you have this nice person from the tribe of Ephraim who hosts them. And this story just goes on and on, but nobody has a name. And, people it's not just that nobody has a name, it's that, well, I did say that there was a nice guy from Ephraim, but really everybody in the story is behaving terribly to each other. It's actually it's a very similar story as the one that we have all the way back in the book of Genesis, in the book of Bereshit, which is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Right, which of course were cities that were eventually destroyed. The story is a story of the way people mistreat each other instead of acting with basic decency towards each other. And that's the story that we have at the end of the book of Judges. Now, the kind of lack of decency is actually really horrific. Maybe I won't go into too much detail for the moment, but I will just say that what really interests me in the story is not what people are doing to each other, but how they could do those sorts of things to each other, how they could behave with such indecency, how they could commit such terrible atrocities. And it starts maybe with small things, they don't want to give each other food, they don't want to host them, but it really, spirals out of control into an entire city raping this concubine. And it's just a horrific story. It's a story of horror. And when I asked myself what went wrong, how things got so out of control, I go back to the question of names. The fact that there are no names in the story means that when people interact with each other, they don't see human beings. They don't see people who have basic rights. the right to dignity, the right to food, the right to protection, the right to be treated not as an object, but as a person, right? And so, that is what that state of namelessness, I think, is designed to show. What happens when you want to treat someone like an object? You take away their name and you put a number on their arm, right? And that says, I don't see you as a person. I see you as an other, right? An object. And that's what has happened at the end of the book of Judges. Now, what's wonderful in the book of Ruth is that the whole goal of the book of Ruth is not just to marry Ruth so that we can reestablish the family line, but the line that is said at the end of the book of Ruth is that Boaz is marrying Ruth Lahakim Shem Hamet al Nachalato, to reestablish the names of this deceased family. In other words, the book of Ruth in some way seems to be about restoring names, which is really an appropriate thing to do during this period of the Judges. And I think it's pretty broad. Even in the book of Ruth, what we see in the backdrop of the story, as we saw earlier when we talked about Naomi's family, is that many of the people in the book are actually, they behave like the people in Judges. They don't want to give food to Naomi when Naomi comes back for Bethlehem. Naomi's family also, they left Bethlehem because they didn't want to share their food. When Ruth comes into Boaz's field, and Boaz is an exception here, right? Boaz is the great hero of the book. He's the one that reestablishes the norm of seeing each other with names, right? But when she comes into his field, he says to her, listen, I'm going to be very nice to you. I want you to pick in the field, and I want you to drink from the water that my young men have drawn from the well. And then he tells her something which I think is chilling. He says to her, Halo tziviti et hane'arim levilti nog'ech. I have commanded the workers in the field, the boys in the field, not to touch you. Right? Which is it's a scathing condemnation of what is going on in Bethlehem during this period of the Judges. In what world does Boaz have to command the boys not to abuse her, not to touch her, not to harass her? So it's in a world where people don't have names. And when you look at the backdrop of the book of Ruth, all of the people that misbehave in the book of Ruth do not have names. There's a lot of anonymous figures in the book of Ruth. So where does that take us to today? I know you asked me about today. I think that the mark of an unhealthy society is one in which people can't see each other. Mm-hmm. They don't see anyone other than their own people, right? The people that they identify with, the people that they agree with. If I don't agree with you, I don't see you, right? And then I other you. And this was something that I think that was particularly, or is particularly a problem that I've seen really in the whole world. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about how politics have become so divisive in the last 30 years, and it's divided families, and people can't talk to people that they disagree with. And here in Israel as well, even though I think in Israel there is a feeling of we all are part of a family, but these kinds of issues, I think, were causing people not to see each other. And I think that if there's one thing that Ruth teaches us, it's that, the first step in healing a society is to greet each other by name, is to see a person standing in front of you, which if you'd like, I mean, maybe I've talked too long about this, but if you'd like, I'd be happy to give you what I think is the main example in the book of that, but you may want to just go on from this topic, which would be fine.
I have a bunch of comments. So let's, I just want to make sure that I get all of it here, and then give your example, because it's nice to get a little bit in the weeds, because I like to learn. I hear you say, so we talked before about how Ruth fits into the kind of the group of Megillot, the different, the books of the Megillah. How do you use the scrolls? Is that what you say? The 5 scrolls.
Yeah.
And we talked about how 3 of them appear on holidays. So like in one way, it's part of that category. But now I hear you saying something else, that like actually another way to think about the canon of the Jewish Bible is to say after the 5 books of Moses comes Joshua, and then kind of comes these 2 parallel books side by side. One is Judges and one is Ruth. They take place at the same time, but they're in conversation with one another. Judges is talking about how we dehumanize people, how there's, the sexual ethic is completely, whatever negative word you want to put in there, is totally off base. There's no recognition of names. People don't go out of the way to be kind. And then we see that's a little bit of the backdrop in the book of Ruth, but Ruth and Boaz, I guess I hear you saying, are somehow flipping that on its head. Great. Okay, and then give us the example and then we'll move on.
Okay, so the example that I think is really the turning point in the book of Ruth is when Naomi decides that she's going to ask Ruth or order Ruth to go down to the threshing floor in the middle of the night in order to, I guess, for lack of a better word, to seduce Boaz so that Naomi can obtain continuity for her family through this act. It's a very suggestive scene. It's problematic on a lot of levels. Ruth is clearly not so enamored of the idea, but she is nothing if not, as we said before, selfless and quite obedient to Naomi, to whom she is utterly and completely devoted. And so she says to Naomi, everything you tell me, I will do, right? And she goes down to the threshing floor, and it's a very suggestive scene. The semantics, the Hebrew words that are used there really suggest this kind of building up of tension. She lies down next to Boaz's feet and she uncovers his feet and she waits until he has eaten and drunk, and she lies there in the middle of the night. And Boaz wakes up in the middle of the night. And the verse tells us, "Vayihi b'chatzi halayla," it was in the midpoint of the night, "Vayecherad ha'ish vayilafet, v'hinei isha shochevet margalotav," right? So we're told it's the middle of the night, the man wakes up, he's terrified, behold, there is a woman lying at his feet. Now, what's interesting about this verse is that there are no names in the verse. There's no Boaz and there's no Ruth. Right, which I think is suggesting that Boaz has this moment in which he wakes up in the middle of the night, finds this, woman at his feet. She seems to be offering herself to him, and he can treat her as an object, right? He can do what he likes, right? Because there's no names here. It's just a man and a woman. And the turning point of the entire book, I think, is the way in which Boaz responds to this moment. The very next verse, Vayomer, and he says, Mi'at, who are you? And again, it seems on some level to be such an unremarkable moment, but it's the moment that he enables her to turn from object to subject. And her response is, I am Ruth, right? He gives her the opportunity to state her name. And at that moment, I think the whole period of the Judges shifts, because Boaz role models what it means to be part of a society in which people see each other, not as objects, but rather as subjects.
Wow. Beautiful. I love that. And that's like a detail. I've always struggled with that scene, because it's kind of like, what's going on here? And I think you adding that moment of the no names to the names, it really shows a transition and shows how Boaz stands out beautifully. I want to just share a reflection that's just coming up for me, like while we're having this conversation, which is I've been in conversation with my sister recently about an article that came out in the New York Times, I think in like 2013, that talks about the importance of a family narrative. The importance that families are, the strongest families are those where it doesn't have to be a good or bad. Actually, it's better if it's oscillating, but this idea that knowing who you came from, being able to say who your grandparents and great-grandparents were and that kind of thing is what shapes resilience for young people today. And then the study even went to show that families that had that family narrative, it helped them, they did better with 9/11 than families who didn't have that, which is very interesting. Of course, the first thing I thought of was the Jewish people, because I feel like, our whole calendar is around, the ups and downs and all that we've survived and all those kinds of moments. I know for me personally, growing up in a home where my grandparents were all Holocaust survivors, it felt like very clear. I knew about the narrative, where we came from, and what we had and what we lost and what we're rebuilding and all those kinds of things. And kind of hearing you describe the book of Ruth and why it might be important in some ways, like, we're doing that here, right? There's this moment of, well, who were King David's great-grandparents? They were Boaz and Ruth, right? And not only who were they, but what did they represent? What were their character traits? What did they go through? What is the Yerusha? What is the family narrative that brings us to David? That's then our narrative. And we're saying not only were they people who represented chesed, which is so core and put David into a position to be successful, right? Because for him to be king, I don't know if maybe he didn't always do chesed, but for the most part, King David was, I won't opine on that. I'm a big fan of King David. But they put him in position to bring those values to the forefront, to do chesed in a way that is self-abrogation, which is extra special for him. And then you're adding on a layer here as well, which is not only do they epitomize chesed, and who needs a book about chesed, as we said, but they epitomize chesed in a time where there was no chesed. Right, in a time where if you look parallel, you see the Shoftim, the judges, it was going in the opposite direction. And these were two people who, no one forced them. Ruth starting with Naomi, deciding to stay on board, and then hearing about Boaz deciding, like you said, he could have been like any other person of that generation and said, oh, there's a woman at the foot of my bed. And instead his first question is, who are you? Right? And similarly, like as you mentioned, when he allows her to pick from his field and allows her to have food when no one else is giving her food. So it feels like to me, if Shavuot is this time where we're celebrating the big picture of Mount Sinai, we're also saying there's like a family narrative that's not as big as all of Bnei Israel, right? It can be as small as one particular family, and the importance of, where did we come from, and what are the character traits that have prepared us for this moment? That's like, I don't know. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I love what you said, that the narrative doesn't have to be all good. It should be oscillating. It's a good and bad narrative because that's a realistic narrative. And one of the things that I think we see in this story, but in the Bible in general, is that while the Bible describes a tremendous amount of bad and sinning and the weaknesses and fallibility of humans and the problems of setting up a society and the dangers of leadership, at the same time, it retains this deep chord of optimism in human beings. And because of that, it never lowers the bar, right? God never lowers the bar. He never says, all right, well, I've seen you guys are really just, quite sinful. So I will reduce the amount that I expect from you, which I think is, one of the flaws of perhaps parenting in the modern world, right? It's a message that retains, I think, great respect for humans and a lot of optimism. And the other point that I thought of when you were speaking is that it also teaches us that the power of the individual to change the entire trajectory of society, which is really, I think, the story of the book of Ruth, and also a tremendously optimistic message, right? Is, everything around you could be falling apart, but that doesn't mean you should crawl into bed and, put the covers over your head. You should go out there and do your small, maybe even, limited acts that you think might have limited influence, but they'll reverberate outwards. And who knows how far your acts can go to change society. And that's the story of Ruth and Boaz.
Wow. So I'll just say that hits me super hard. It's interesting that you mentioned that because it was actually, I mentioned before that I'm interested in Musar, Jewish character development, which really focused on before you worry about changing the world, can you change yourself? Can you work on yourself? And really, there are a few inflection points in my life that I think brought me there, but one of them, we mentioned that you live in Alon Shvut, you teach in the Gush, was, I guess it was the summer of 2014, when the 3 boys were abducted in the Gush. And I remember specifically that summer feeling so helpless, feeling like, this is crazy. What can we do? I'm just a person. What can I do about this? This is total insanity. I can't, I went to school there. There's people waiting for a bus and they're getting abducted. And of course, unfortunately, we found out terrible news about them later, that they had been murdered. And I think that was one of the reasons that I turned to Musar, in that moment, feeling like, okay, I don't have that kind of power. I don't know how to change the world, but can I try to be someone who's a little bit more patient, a little bit more chesed, a little bit, that kind of thing. And so I think that message, again, in the backdrop, in conversation with this big moment of Mount Sinai, of everyone sitting there to receive the Torah, and it's this huge contractual moment and covenant and beautiful and all those kind of things. But where does the work start? It starts with, can you be Ruth? It's beautiful that you talked about how much Ruth removes herself, but the book is named after her ultimately, right? Which of course, as we know, she didn't choose, but that's this beautiful poetic thing, which is she gets a book named after her in the canon of the Jewish people. All right, I'm going to ask you last question before we close. This is totally off this topic, but I'm just going to throw it at you anyway, which is, alongside being the season of Shavuot, we are in the season of Bamidbar. We're in the season of looking at the book of Numbers. I mentioned at the beginning, you reframe the book of Numbers for me by looking at the book of Joshua. In a sentence or two, your advice to people that are, exploring the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers right now. Give them a suitcase to bring with them in their luggage as they think about the book of Bamidbar.
Well, the book of Bamidbar also, I think, is a book where things really go awry and then find a tikkun, right? Which is, of course, that it's the book of two separate generations. The first part of the book is about the generation of those who have exited Egypt, and they turn out to be, disqualified from entering the land of Israel. We think they're going to enter the land of Israel, but they just don't have the character that is necessary for them to go into the land. And so what transpires is a series of sins, of course, culminating in the sin of the spies that show that they just don't trust God enough to be successful in the land of Israel, which requires, until today, a lot of trust in God in order to be able to live there. The second generation, which is the generation that is born in the desert, right? So we only really begin to talk about that generation entering the land starting in chapter 20 of the book. But that final section of the book describes for us this generation, which is going to be the generation that is qualified to enter the land, not because they don't sin, but because they have, I think they have a different sort of sinning, right? They have, even though they do sin, they're not kind of looking backward with longing at this life in which they were, slaves that were, dependent on their masters, but, they're looking forward towards a life in the land of Israel. They've been born, raised, and cultivated in the desert, which requires a very high level of faith in God, and it enables them to be the generation that enters the land.
Beautiful. All right, so we have more stories of oscillating narratives of the big family and the microcosm of individual families as well. Dr. Yael Ziegler, I want to thank you so much. If you don't have her book, Ruth, I strongly suggest picking it up. I mentioned her other books before, on Oath and also on Lamentations, and we look forward to, please God, seeing your book on the first 15 chapters of Exodus. And I know that you can find more of your teachings and writings on the virtual Beit Midrash as well. Anywhere else people can find you?
I mean, not in terms of writing, but, there's lots of classes up on YouTube, none of which I put up, but they're Great. Out there.
So Google her and find her on YouTube. All right, thank you so much. Wishing you an amazing Shavuot. It should go well. We'll see you at Sinai, and we should have good news about the Jewish people and Jewish narratives, and we should all be inspired by Ruth to do our small part in bringing us closer to a better Jewish people. Thank you so much.
Amen. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.